A police officer stopped a black man, not realizing he was face to face with the city's new police commissioner. When Daniel revealed his badge, the crowd fell silent. This moment changed everything, forcing everyone to confront the face of bias. The events that followed would shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Daniel Wallace entered the local supermarket after a demanding first day as the new police commissioner. He hoped this would be the one place he could momentarily forget about work, pick up some dinner essentials, and head home to his family. Standing tall and commanding, Daniel still tried to keep a low profile, moving between aisles until a young patrol officer, Jason Miller, approached him. Jason's face hardened the moment he looked at Daniel. A spark of suspicion flashed in his eyes as he walked toward him, as though he expected trouble. With a sharp tone, he spoke. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Initially thinking this was just an offhand remark, Daniel responded calmly. "I'm picking up groceries for my family." Yet Jason scrutinized him as if he were a suspect, watching each move as though anticipating hostility. His gaze flicked to the badge clipped to Daniel's belt, dismissing it without a second thought. Daniel decided to keep his answers brief to avoid further questions, but this only intensified Jason's suspicion. "I haven't seen you around here before. Do you live in this neighborhood?" Jason asked, his tone pointed, as though it were his duty to track Daniel's every step in the store. By this point, onlookers, drawn by the officer's sharp tone and persistence, began slowing their carts, quietly observing and murmuring to each other. Another officer joined Jason, exchanging a meaningful look with him. Feeling the attention on him, Jason decided to make a point, pulling out a notepad and saying with emphasis, "Let me see your ID." Suppressing his irritation, Daniel decided to cooperate, hoping to end the situation. He slowly took out his driver's license and handed it to Jason, expecting this would show there was no reason for suspicion. Yet Jason barely glanced at it before rolling his eyes and returning it, as if it weren't enough. "You don't think I'd just take your word for it, do you?" he said mockingly. This time, Daniel felt a surge of anger, but kept his composure to prevent further escalation. He glanced at the crowd, now intently watching, and noticed a boy recording the scene with his phone. The tension was growing, and Daniel knew that even a single word or movement could turn this into an even more charged encounter. At that moment, Daniel's young daughter, who had been waiting nearby, ran over and held his hand. Seeing her father's serious face and Jason's aggressive tone, she asked fearfully, "Daddy, what's happening? Why are they talking to you like that?" Jason appeared unfazed by her presence, pressing forward, still unaware of who he was dealing with. Daniel Wallace, a tall, dignified man in a suit, had entered the local supermarket to pick up groceries for his family. It was his first day as the city's new police commissioner, and he hoped to unwind a bit by stopping for a few items on his way home. Focused on selecting produce, he was approached by a young patrol officer with a serious expression. "Sir, I need to know what you're doing here," the officer, Jason Miller, said coldly, fixing Daniel with a scrutinizing stare. Surprised by Jason's tone, Daniel replied calmly, "I'm just buying some groceries." But Jason didn't look away or soften. Internally, he had already marked Daniel as a suspect, feeling his duty was to deal with him and prove his vigilance. This exchange could have ended politely, but Jason chose to press on. "I haven't seen you here before," he remarked suspiciously. "Do you live in this area?" Daniel was starting to lose patience, but kept himself in check for the sake of peace. His driver's license, complete with his name and address, was in his pocket, though he hoped the conversation would end without him having to present it. But Jason's gaze remained sharp, with an eagerness to continue his interrogation. A crowd began gathering, shoppers who had lingered, slowing their pace and surreptitiously observing. Sensing the crowd's attention, Jason saw an opportunity to assert himself and loudly added, "I'm going to need to see your ID." Daniel didn't argue. He calmly retrieved his driver's license and handed it to the officer, confident it would settle the matter. But Jason barely glanced at it before dismissively handing it back. "You know, I don't think that's enough," he sneered. "Do you have any other documents? Something that might prove your honesty?" Irritation flashed briefly across Daniel's face, but he held it in. At that moment, his young daughter, who had been watching from afar, approached and took his hand, asking worriedly, "Daddy, is everything okay?" Jason looked at the girl, but continued his interrogation as if her presence were irrelevant. This was the last straw for Daniel, but he decided to end this on his own terms, with a move that would completely shift the situation once he revealed his commissioner's badge. Daniel's young daughter clutched his hand, puzzled by the officer's aggressive treatment of her father. The crowd stood still, murmuring as they observed the officer's strange behavior. Jason, confident in his control over the situation, decided to humiliate Daniel further. "You know, you're required to answer my questions," he declared loudly, taking a step closer and raising his voice to ensure everyone could hear. "If you don't have a good reason for being here, we might need to take you down to the station." Daniel took a deep breath, understanding the situation had become critical and that there was no point in tolerating it any longer. The crowd held its breath, awaiting his response. Gathering his thoughts, Daniel calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out his police commissioner badge, and handed it to Jason, meeting his gaze directly. For a moment, everyone froze, including Jason himself. At first, he was so certain of his authority that he didn't even bother looking at the badge. But curiosity finally got the better of him. When he glanced at it, his expression changed instantly. His eyes filled with confusion, shock, and dismay. He realized that standing before him was not just any man, but the city's new police commissioner. The crowd noticed Jason's reaction, and people began whispering louder, recording the unfolding scene on their phones. The second officer, who had been standing nearby, also looked at the badge and immediately stepped back, realizing they had grossly overstepped with someone far above their rank. Jason stammered, trying to salvage the situation, muttering something like, "Sorry, sir, I didn't know. It was just a check." But it was too late. To the crowd, he looked ignorant and biased, and his apologies sounded hollow. Daniel remained calm, but his piercing gaze made it clear he wouldn't let this incident go lightly. "Don't you think, Officer Miller, that before suspecting someone, you should make an effort to understand the situation?" His tone was firm and cold. "Especially when it involves the people you're supposed to protect, not degrade." Jason dropped his gaze, aware he'd made a serious mistake. His face flushed, feeling the crowd's judgmental stares behind him. Daniel's reputation seemed to soar in the eyes of the onlookers, while the officer looked small and humiliated. "We'll need to discuss your conduct later, in a more appropriate setting," Daniel added, giving a restrained nod and putting his badge back in his pocket. Taking his daughter's hand, he headed toward the exit, leaving behind a stunned Jason, the murmuring crowd, and the dawning realization that this encounter would bring significant change for both the officer and the entire police department. The next day, the story of the incident spread throughout the city. People shared phone footage, discussing Officer Miller's behavior and Daniel's calm restraint despite the provocations. Local news picked up the story, and soon headlines buzzed with debates on bias and racial discrimination in even the seemingly peaceful communities. Realizing that the incident shouldn't go unnoticed, Daniel called a special meeting with Jason and other department officers. The conference room was full, and the tension was palpable. Jason, looking nervous and defeated, sat at the end of the table, waiting to see what would happen. Daniel stood to begin the discussion. "Yesterday, an incident occurred that requires serious reflection," he began calmly but firmly. "Not just by Officer Miller, but by the entire department." In the silence, officers exchanged glances, understanding this concerned them all, not just Jason. Daniel continued, "As commissioner, I expect you to treat everyone you encounter fairly and professionally. But instead, I witnessed how bias and stereotypes dictated an officer's behavior." Jason looked down, knowing it was pointless to defend himself. Shame and fear for his career overwhelmed him. Daniel turned his gaze toward him. "Officer Miller, I'm sure you're not the only one who may be unaware of certain biases. But you need to understand, your duty is to protect and support citizens, not cast suspicion based on appearance. Moments like these erode public trust in the police." The meeting continued, and Daniel, recognizing the need for change, announced the introduction of bias awareness programs and training for all department members. These measures would not only teach new approaches, but also help officers understand their role in creating a safe and fair environment. Jason, to his surprise, wasn't dismissed, but was assigned to undergo multiple levels of training and mentorship under senior officers. He was given a chance to correct his mistakes and realized that his duty was to serve all residents, regardless of skin color or appearance. That evening, Daniel returned home to find his daughter watching the news coverage of the supermarket incident at the kitchen table. She turned to her father, looking up at him with admiration, and said, "Daddy, you're a real hero. Thank you for doing that." Daniel smiled, warmed by her words. He knew there was much work ahead to bring about change in the system, but he also understood that every small step, every action, could lead to real progress.